So Michael Cheika is no longer the Wallabies head coach. He goes out in a very, very divisive way. He goes out swinging, and I want to answer two questions on this video, guys. I want to give my thoughts, and there are two questions that I want to get to. Number one, was Michael Cheika, during his reign as the Wallabies head coach, was he good for Australian rugby? And number two, where to next for Australian rugby? Kia ora everyone, my name's Zach. I love rugby. Welcome back to Hakatime Rugby. I'll put my cards on the table first. I'm a rugby fan, guys. I'm an All Blacks fan. I remember when the Wallabies were strong, and I miss that old traditional rivalry. I want to see Australian rugby do well. So I'm going to give my thoughts based on that perspective, right? I'm impartial in terms of Australian rugby. I'm looking from afar, we can say, and I just want to summarise my analysis of Michael Cheika and Australian rugby as a whole, and then work out what they can do to improve the situation, because you would have to say, based on this World Cup, the Wallabies did underperform, well, certainly against the usual high standards, and it just feels like Australian rugby is not in a good place right now. So we will start with Michael Cheika's record. So he finishes with a 50% win record. Relative to his peers, that's probably underperformed, but he did inherit a team from Ewan McKenzie that had a 50% win rate. So you would have to say, on balance of things, he maintained that level of success or failure, depending on how you want to look at it. Against Tier 1 teams, he had a 42% win rate. You would have to say that is not good enough for an Australian rugby team. And against the All Blacks in particular, and I think this is probably his biggest regret, is that he will go with a record of 14 matches, 11 losses, 3 wins. That's a 21% win rate. That's probably his biggest regret. I guess his biggest achievement, though, just to counterbalance that, he was able to lead the Wallabies to the final of the 2015 Rugby World Cup. That was a huge achievement, right? So at that point in time, the Wallabies were certainly not a favoured team in that Rugby World Cup. The All Blacks were, and they did very, very well. Now, some will say that they got lucky to get there. We see luck in knockout matches all the time in Rugby World Cups. We've probably seen one or two examples of that in this Rugby World Cup. But the bottom line is they made a final. They were competitive in the final. In particular, they did well to come back when they were down on points. And they gave the All Blacks a bit of a run in that final. So that's probably going to go down as his biggest achievement, and that should be an achievement that should be celebrated by Australians across the board. In terms of this World Cup, though, guys, you will know they were bounced out in the quarterfinal, and it just had a feeling that Australian rugby is not in a good place. They had a couple of knockbacks, and let's focus on their two critical games. So it really came down to games between Wales and England, which ultimately decided the fate of this Wallabies team. And there were a couple of main criticisms of Cheika, I guess, during this Rugby World Cup. Number one, he was very much seen as a bit of a loose cannon in the press conferences. So he came out with words like, he would say, "Oh, we're being discriminated against." There was obviously the suspension of Reece Hodge, in which case he came out and said, "They're targeting us unfairly, we're being discriminated against, I don't know the rules anymore." For a head coach, you've really got to get your head together, and I think that is criticism that is fairly targeted at Cheika, to say, you're just sounding like a bit of a whinger. And I personally thought he just came across as a bit of a whinger in those situations. The second major criticism was that he didn't have his final team bedded down, even going into some of those big matches. So, that game against Wales where he led out with guys like Bernard Foley. So he was the starting first choice fly half there. And obviously it didn't go on. To his credit, he pulled him at half time and put in Tumua. Tumua seemed to have a much better game. And then ultimately they settled on the combination of Leali'ifano and Tumua as their first choice 10s, let's say. To be doing that during a World Cup, though, is not a good look. And I think that's one where he has copped, again, some fair criticism to say, you don't know who your starting 15 is, you're trialling during the World Cup, it's not a good look, so fair enough there. The third major point of criticism that he's receiving over this Rugby World Cup is really the tactics that they employed in the final there against England. They very much had, we're playing the following brand of rugby, that is what Australian rugby is all about, that's what our fans demand of us, and wind, rain, no matter what, we're going to back it to the very, very end, to the bitter end. Well, I think tactically they got a number of things wrong in that final. They certainly had a team that could have challenged this English team, but they really didn't execute on the day. And I think that's something that we can look at again and say it's probably fair criticism on Cheika there. And I want to dive deeper into why he got to that level where, it seemed he was frustrated when dealing with the press conferences. It seemed that he hadn't bedded down his final combinations, and it also seemed like tactically he was an all-in approach on a tactic that probably wasn't going to win that game. There was a point in the English game where they were very, very close, where it was prime opportunity to pivot somewhat and to look at alternative options to try and close out that game. When you're 17-16, 1 point behind, it's a different level of tactics, and I think they probably left Leali'ifano out there a little bit too long, maybe 5 or 6 minutes too long, 10 minutes too long. There were just some things that they could have done there to really pull that game back in. They weren't able to contain England in the end, and the rest is history. And then ultimately he resigned a couple of days after that match, and he went out swinging. Right? So he went out swinging against the administration. He made it very clear he does not have a relationship with Raelene Castle, the CEO, and also the chairman. So next point of focus in this discussion, we're going to view what we think about that relationship, because it seems like now there is a lot of stuff that is coming out that is hinting to issues off the field with Australian Rugby Union, with the CEO, with the board, with all of those things. And I always believe that where there is smoke, there is fire. Obviously, we've heard from Raelene Castle and we've heard from Michael Cheika. I think the answer on these situations is always somewhere in the middle. Diplomatic response from Raelene Castle, relationships between coaches and CEOs are very, very complex. Well, that's Captain Obvious speaking, right? But at the end of the day, they have to get those kinds of things right if they want to be competitive in the major tournaments. So let's dive deeper into that. Okay, guys, now where I want to start with the off-field discussions is really on whether or not Michael Cheika was empowered fully with all resources and with the autonomy to go and deliver on a Rugby World Cup. My view, from what I've seen, is the answer is no. Now, we see what the value is of being fully autonomous. If you look at guys like Steve Hansen, Rassie Erasmus, Eddie Jones, Warren Gatland, they just happen to be in the semi-finals of the Rugby World Cup, and you would have to say that each one of those coaches has been given full autonomy on their decisions, and they will be judged on the outcome of the Rugby World Cup. They have full autonomy there. They have full support from their respective boards as well as the public. That is very, very clear. And with that, they are able to develop game plans, team structures, etc., etc., to really be competitive. And I think without giving that level of autonomy to a coach, you do not set them up for success. You basically put shackles on them and make their job a lot harder. And I do believe that's what Cheika had to deal with. So firstly, he has hinted at relationship issues with the CEO, Raelene Castle. As I mentioned, I think where there is smoke, there is fire. Right. The second thing, there was a change in structure implemented by the Australian Rugby Union, and it was based on results from the Wallabies. They implemented a director of rugby which sat directly above Michael Cheika in the reporting structure. His name was Scott Johnson, and Cheika came out publicly and said, well, he had no issues with Scott as an individual. He just felt like the autonomy in the role was not there for him to perform. Now, is that a cop-out or is that fair commentary? I probably think it is fair. I think that for a head coach in particular, it undermines their abilities if you're saying, based on performances, we don't trust you, yes, we'll keep you on, but we want someone else there to oversee what you are doing. Anyone in their role who is put in that situation will feel undervalued. So I do not think that that structure is correct to get the best outcome. If you look at these other four head coaches, as I mentioned, they are the head of their respective organizations from a coaching perspective. They are given all the resources to go and do the job, and you would have to say that performances are speaking for themselves. Four coaches, all empowered, all given a level of autonomy, and all performing on the field. A guy like Michael Cheika with that new structure where he is has a level of reporting function above him, obviously he has not felt empowered and he has not delivered on the field. So I think that is probably fair for Michael Cheika to come out and challenge that structure. He probably could have done a better job of doing it during his tenure. Very easy to throw stones afterwards, but I think that's probably fair enough. So with that said, some other issues that he's dealt with off the field. And probably before we move on here, I just want to go in on this Quade Cooper situation where he came out and said if Michael Cheika actually cared about Australian rugby, then he would have quit a long time ago. Now, my view is twofold on this. As an outsider looking in, it looks to me like there is no more passionate individual for Australian rugby than Michael Cheika. He's very passionate about the Wallabies jersey, and you can see personally he's fully invested, and that's probably why he gets a little bit frustrated and stressed and comes out with all these outlandish comments. But I don't think you can question his commitment to Australian rugby. So that's where I'd like to start that one. The second thing, Quade Cooper, for a guy to come out when an individual has resigned, obviously going through a tough time, ask for a level of compassion from reporters, I think is just classless. I think Quade Cooper is a bit of a grub, to be honest, to come out with those statements. So I just wanted to go in on that one just briefly. The next thing I want to discuss in terms of off-field distractions, the Israel Folau incident. So I'm not going to recap too much of the details on that, but obviously that has led to a lot of distractions for both the playing group and the administration and the coaching staff. So I think that's one, nobody's fault, except for Israel Folau, depending on your viewpoints. I don't want to get into that political discussion. But it's one where it has certainly impacted the team. It's certainly impacted the preparation and just made that job a little bit tougher along the way. So I think that's one where fairly, again, unfortunately this guy is dealing with so many issues both on and off the field. It becomes very, very difficult to perform. So where to next on this discussion? I think what we'll do is just wrap this all up. So one thing I'll say about Michael Cheika, and I alluded to this, there's no more passionate person, more passionate about the Wallabies and Australian rugby, I think, than Michael Cheika. He really did give it his all. And I think that's how he should be remembered, as someone who really gave everything he had to the jersey. He made mistakes along the way for sure, right? For sure. And I think I highlighted a number of those in the World Cup where he could have better applied himself. But I do think in any role you have to be empowered to do the job. Where I'll close this, it's very, very clear that he had the full support of the playing group. Now that he has resigned, each of the players that performed under him, guys like David Pocock, guys like James O'Connor, guys like Michael Hooper, they've all come out in support of their coach. They don't have to give that support now, but they've all come out in support. And I think that's a testament to probably the environment that he has created. My personal view is that Cheika got caught into building a siege mentality around the Wallabies team. He didn't feel supported, both by the public, both by the ARU. He felt a little bit out there, and he even made comments like, we're being discriminated against, we're being ambushed. He just seemed to feel like it was him against the world, and he created that environment within the team. My view is that that's a mistake, right? Because it also led to some tactical errors during the Rugby World Cup. So I guess where I'd like to close this, I would never question his commitment to the jersey, but I would say that given all of those factors externally, he certainly did not perform in the role. And that's a real shame. So where to next for Australian rugby? I think Australian rugby needs to have a good hard look at itself. And I was very concerned when Raelene Castle came out and said they do not intend to do a formal review on the state of Australian rugby. They had a previous review done, and they're going to take components of that. You've just completed a World Cup cycle, and there is no rush to go in and find a new coach. He also said that they want to go and find a coach very, very quickly. Again, I think rushing into that is a very, very big mistake. It's time for Australian rugby to take stock, and it's to take stock at all levels. With an impartial review, I truly believe that is the best starting point here. It should not be commissioned by the CEO. It should be commissioned by the board, and it should look at the CEO. It should look at governance. It should look around whether or not the structure around the director of rugby has been successful. It should look around whether or not the coach has been empowered. It should look about how to fix grassroots rugby. It should look at all of those components, because at the end of the day, this is a very, very complex situation, and it requires a complex solution. Brushing it off like the CEO is doing is not a good look for Australian rugby, and rushing into decision-making around a new coach as well, I think, is a mistake. So for me, I'd like to see them take that time and really do a good impartial review and come out with solid, tangible outcomes, rather than rushing into more mistakes. I don't think Raelene Castle is the right person for this role. I think that there is too many factors at play that she's not controlling well enough. I mean, the Israel Folau situation, for example, is still going through the courts. That's going to be very, very messy. Now the coaching relationship, that's going to be very, very messy. She's just been painted with this brush of what I think is quick decision-making. And while it's important to be decisive as a CEO, it's important also to make the right calls. You live or die by your calls as a CEO there. So I think she's being a bit too rushed in her decision-making. She's trying to give the illusion of being in complete control, but I actually think it's leading Australian rugby down another poor path. And I feel sorry for any coach that's going to take up the next role. If those issues off the field are not resolved, then you are setting up this coach again for failure. Let's come back in a year's time and review. Let's see if they have what they've done to rectify this and how they're tracking against this. But I want to see a very clear plan from Australian rugby, and I want to see them implement that plan effectively. That's my thoughts, guys. That's what I think. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment down below. Do you think Cheika did a good job, bad job? Do you think he was supported, not supported? And where does Australian go to next, guys? That's it for today. A lot of talking points there, a lot of conversation. Thank you for joining in, guys, and we'll see you in the next one.